Today's show is sponsored by the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. It's hard to believe that it's already that time of year, but the gathering will be happening in just a few weeks on January 28th through February 2nd. I'll be performing at the gathering along with my guest today, Corb Lund. If you'd like to catch one of Corb's performances, I'm told that there are still tickets available for the Saturday night show titled Bridging the 49th. The show features an incredible lineup of Canadian performers, including Corb, Coulter Wall, and Ian Tyson. You can buy tickets to that show and find more information about the gathering at nationalcowboypoetrygathering.org. I hope to see you there. I'd like to start today's show with the Bruce Kiskadden poem entitled The Creak of the Leather. It's likely that you can remember a corral at the foot of a hill, some morning along in December when the air was so cold and so still, when the frost lay as light as a feather and the stars had just blinked out and gone. Remember the creak of the leather as you saddled your horse in the dawn? When the glow of the sunset had faded and you reached that corral after night on a horse that was weary and jaded and so hungry your belt wasn't tight. You felt about ready to weaken. You know you had been a long way, but that old saddle still kept a-creaking, like it did at the start of the day. Perhaps you can mind when your saddle was standing up high at the back and you started a wail of a battle when you got that old pony untracked. How you and that horse stuck together is a thing you can't hardly explain. And the rattle and creak of the leather as it met with the jar and the strain. You've been on a stand in the cedars when the air was so quiet and dead, not even some flies and mosquitoes to buzz and make noise round your head. You watched for wild horses and cattle when the place was as silent as death. But you heard the soft creak of the saddle every time that horse took a breath. And when the roundup was working, all day you'd been riding hard, there wasn't a chance of your shirking, you was pulled for the second guard. Well, a sad, homesick feeling come sneaking as you sung to the cows in the moon, and you heard the old saddle a-creaking along to the sound of the tune. There was times when the sun was sure blazing on a perishing hot summer day. Mirages would keep you a-gazing and the dust devils danced far away. You cussed at the thirst and the weather. You rode at a slow jogging trot. And you noticed that somehow the leather creaks different when once it gets hot. Well, you're old, and your eyes have grown hollow, and your hair has a tinge of the snow. But there's always the memories that follow from the trails of the dim long ago. There are things that will haunt you forever. And you notice that, strange as it seems, one sound, the soft creak of the leather, weaves into your memories and dreams. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Corb Lund. Corb is a singer-songwriter from Alberta, Canada, and he told me one time that he plays scruffy western music from the Canadian Rockies. I've been trying to get together with Corb for this interview for quite a while, and we were finally able to get together in Lubbock, Texas, where he was passing through for a gig and recorded this interview. Here's Corb Lund.
My people, both sides of my family, the Lund side and my mom's side, which is the Ivan side, came from Utah up to Alberta Alberta, for those that don't know, is directly north of Montana. It's Colorado, then Wyoming, then Montana. Both sides of my family came from Utah around the turn of the century, and they both homesteaded up there. Both my great grandpas, and they were ranching in Utah. And then they were, a lot of them were converts because they're Danish, a lot of them, and they were Mormon converts. I've drifted quite far from the fold, but the roots of the family are somewhat Mormon. And one of Joseph Smith's buddies, the way I understand it, was Danish. So when he first started recruiting people for the church, they went to Denmark. And I always suspect that when that happens, there's also a land carrot being dangled, like free land in this religion thing, and free land, you know. So I'm guessing. But my triple great grandpa Lund, we found the upside of Mormon culture that I'm familiar with is that they're really into genealogy. So they have arcane reasons for that, but the practical side of it is they're really into genealogy, and you can really dig into your family if you can tie into a Mormon root. And my triple great grandpa Paul Soltoft Lund came over from Denmark in, I want to say 1850 something. Anyway, he was on this ship, and we found the manifest for the ship. And he had a bunch of purebred Danish cattle with him on the boat. So I guess the cows go back pretty far. But there's a book written about this voyage actually, and there was a big storm, and they had to get rid of all the weight, so they had to throw all that livestock overboard. So they didn't make it to North America. And then they went to Utah, and then, like I said, both sides came up to Alberta and homesteaded there. And the Lund Ranch that my great grandpa homesteaded is underwater now. It's a big dam up there, and the Ivan side we still have, and it's in the southwestern corner of Alberta, sort of near Glacier Park, where people from Montana will know Glacier Park. It's just over the border. It's not a big place, it's a few sections, and apparently it was more back in the day, but the story is my great grandpa lost some of it during this depression. And I mean, we've never had a huge place or anything, but culturally all of my people have been chasing cows and ranching for a long time. So it's interesting because we still have the place in southern Alberta, and it's still it's too small to make a living on now because it's been chopped up. Each generation we all get along, but each generation gets a piece of it, and so every family now has a couple of quarters or something. So it's more of we put cows on it, but it's more of like a family touchstone than anything at this point. I think my grandpas were the last generation in our family just to raise cows, and even then my grandmas were both country school teachers, so that's probably a common story. But as you probably know, it gets harder and harder to just make a living doing that unless you got a real big place. So my dad he had cows, but he was also a large animal vet and a Western artist and a rodeo cowboy too. Not that there's money in that back then, but and yeah, the rodeo thing, I didn't do a lot of it. I went as a kid to tons of them when I was following Dad around. He was a pro bulldogger in Canada. But I rode steers when I was a kid and bulldogged a little bit in high school, and then I got into music when I was about 15, so I retired pretty early. But I'm certainly very familiar with it and grew up with it. Mom was a champion barrel racer. She won Calgary Stampede. That's our big one back up in Alberta. She won that in 59, I think, the first year they had barrel racing as a major event. So she's a pioneer of the Calgary Stampede. Both grandpas rode broncs and roped. Mom's dad was more of a roper. He mostly roped. My grandpa Lund was a bronc rider. And there's a story, one of the oldest rodeos in Canada is the Raymond Stampede. I think they started in 1902. And there's a story that my great-grandfather Lund rode the first bronc on Main Street at the first Raymond Stampede, so that's pretty cool. And there was also a time, big Mormon family, so my great-grandpa had 6 sons and 5 daughters, 11. So my grandfather had 10 siblings. And they say there was one year at Raymond when they had 6 buck and shoots with 6 broncs in them, and there was a Lund brother on every one of them. It's pretty cool. I can picture when Dad finally decided to retire from bulldogging, because you get older. It's like the Garth song, right? Saddle's getting cold, But I remember the day when he made the decision and told us, and he was real broke up about it. But I wrote a tune. I'll play a little bit of it about that exact thing. It's called "We Used to Ride 'Em." This is partly about my dad retiring, and partly about a pair of old Crockett spurs we have in the family from the 30s. The wind still blows the dust across the exhibition grounds. chute still creaks and moans and echoes saddle bronching sounds. The horses all wound up the same as the ones that come before. But we don't ride 'em anymore. There was a tear in his eye the day that I remember very well. He said his luck was gone and his draw was bad and his riding had gone all to hell. He said Skull and Dodge and Belvedere had found new men to adore. We don't ride 'em anymore. On from there. It's funny, I'm not sure Skull and Dodge and Belvedere were sponsors when I was a kid. Belvedere cigarettes, that's a Canadian thing. I don't know, have you heard of those? Belvedere cigarettes?
I have.
They were a big rodeo sponsor in Canada in the 70s. And Skull and Dodge trucks back then.
I've heard you talk before about your grandpa singing some old cowboy songs that had like local, regional references. And was he a musician or
No, not at all. They're sort of, especially the Grandpa Lund. He would just sing those old ballads. I think in those days maybe it came from a time when music wasn't really viewed as much as a career as it was a means of personal entertainment, right? And also
folk music.
Yeah, we talk about that at Elko all the time. But in those days, it was a personal entertainment, and it was a way of transmitting history, right? Oral history. But yeah, he used to sing When the Work's All Done This Fall and Strawberry Roan and Little Joe the Wrangler, those songs. And yeah, and then it was interesting to me because I was obsessed with them from him, and then I even more obsessed when I got my hands on Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs, the Marty Robbins record. And then I was, being an inquisitive kid, I was immediately, my ears pricked up because some of the words that Marty was singing were different than the words that Grandpa was singing. Some of the gear references and some of the horse slang and some of the geographical references. The one that comes to mind is, what is it in it's been a long time, but in When the Work's All Done This Fall, that line about we were camped out at the Pecos.
is it Little Joe the Wrangler?
Yeah, right, Little Joe.
Right.
And we were camped out at the Pecos. I think that's the way I've heard it sung.
I think that's right.
Because Grandpa used to sing "Camped Out of the Pagan," and that's a Blackfoot Indian reserve up around where we're from. So
Wow.
I always thought that was neat because in those days when there's a mothership radio station corporation like there is today, and you hear a song, everybody hears the same version of the song, right? But back then it was like drift, like it would drift. It would be passed from one guy to another guy to another guy, and it would, I guess the stuff would change based on their regional culture, or kind of stuff.
Did you ever, those songs from your grandpa, did you ever pick up any of those little regional differences and like work them up into those songs yourself? Or
well, I sometimes drop in a couple of it. Well, honestly, sometimes it drifts in my own head, so sometimes I don't remember which version I'm singing. There's a few options at different various points, and I slot them in as I feel. And I can't honestly remember some of, like the obvious ones, the geographical ones, I would remember, but I can't remember some of the slang stuff. I can't remember what the original version even is. And I mean, and my original version is Marty Robbins, but I'm sure that's not original either. Obviously, right? He's probably. I think some of the versions that I've heard that predate Marty are different than the Marty versions. Again, so it's like. Choose your adventure, right?
Yeah, right.
When we were doing that, I remember it was useful when I recorded a Siri Peets with Coulter Wall a few months ago, and I remember calling you, and because there's so many versions of it, and so much kind of disinformation about it or whatever. It was interesting because you study that stuff. I was interested to hear your. Because you seem to know about the actual history of the tune, and you were able to point me toward the accurate original lyrics, huh?
I first heard cowboy and western music as a kid from the cassette tapes that belonged to my dad. He had albums by people like Tex Ritter, Jimmy Rogers, the Sons of the Pioneers, and Marty Robbins. One album that I listened to over and over was the Marty Robbins record, Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs, which seems to have been an important record for many of us who love and play cowboy music.
Well, musically, it's funny because that Gunfighter Ballads record is the first record that I really liked as a kid, and it's still my favorite record to this day. I'm just lucky I picked up a good one, because I mean, I would imagine a lot of people's favorite first record is ridiculous to them now, right? But that record is still ground zero for me. It's the production on it, and the guitar playing, and the way he sings, and the writing. It's all great. And then there's the sequel too, more Gunfighters and Trail Songs, and then there's Return of the Gunfighter. There's a box set I got, and there's about 80 cowboy songs, way more than I knew about that he'd recorded. And there's like about 3 or 4. He takes about 3 or 4 swings at like a sequel to El Paso. He's got one. Do you know these songs? He's got El Paso City. People know that one. Yeah. He's got one called Felita. It's all about the girl, the dancing girl. Right. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and yeah, so that was the music I was, and Johnny Horton too was big, and Jim Reeves actually. I mean, you're subject to your parents' taste at that point, right? And that was what was in the record rack at our house, and some old Elvis and some little Statler Brothers. The first music that I think I discovered that wasn't through the parents was the Eagles. I was in about grade 7, and then in about grade 12, I got into rock and roll music, and that's actually what made me pick up the guitar. Strangely, I'd taken a shot at learning to play acoustic when I was maybe in grade 8 or 9, but didn't stick. But yeah, I was into rock and roll music in high school, because it was funny. Because to me, a lot of the Western stuff just sort of seemed normal. I know that a lot of people who aren't in that world or don't grow up with it, especially people from other countries, find Western cowboy stuff super exotic. But to me, that seemed just sort of like normal. I was kind of bored of it as a teenager, and I found like rock and roll super interesting. So I learned to play guitar on a Gibson Les Paul, and I was in a rock band for about 9 years called the Smalls, and we were sort of an underground rock band. I was always trying to I wrote about a third or maybe a quarter of the lyrics, and I was always trying to inject Western themes into the heavy rock songs, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. And there was a brief period in my teens when I went to a few high school rodeos, steer wrestling, and when I was a preteen, until you're 14, I rode steers too. But that was the end of that when I discovered music, and then probably about halfway through the rock band thing, I figured out that all those old Marty Robbins songs were quite playable now that I knew how to play guitar. So I was probably in my mid-20s when I first started writing Western songs. And that one I played you a minute ago was the first one. We used to write them. And I think that was maybe 25 or something like that. And then the rock band eventually retired in a couple of years, and I just started. In fact, I had started playing Western gigs on the side, even like when the rock band was still going in the late 90s. And then when that retired, I started doing it full time, and I made a record called $5 Bill. And that was sort of my first major serious effort at writing Western music. And that was, I've got 5 or 6 since then.
When did you first hear Ian Tyson's music?
It was always drifting around, because if you're from Alberta, and especially if you're a cowboy kid, it's around. I didn't really become fully later than you think. I became fully aware of it later than you'd think. Like, my dad was a Western artist, and he would go to events like Elko. He didn't go to Elko, but he'd go to cowboy poetry gatherings and art shows and stuff like that. And that was the first time I remember really focusing on Ian. So I was probably in my mid-20s or late 20s. And then I met him a few years later, shortly after that $5 Bill record came out. I was part of a tribute show called The Gift. It was a bunch of us doing Ian songs, and he showed up at one of them and made us all nervous. But yeah, I met him then. He was real nice to me. And he'd heard my record. He really keeps up, that guy. Like he keeps up with modern music way more than I do. Like, he knows all the new writers and stuff. And he's always turning me on to stuff. I don't have the patience. I always go back and listen to old stuff. I just don't have the patience to sift through a lot of new stuff unless someone gives it to me and recommends it. But yeah, Ian, he's pretty with it.
How did you move from you guys meet up to obviously now y'all seem to have a really close relationship, and if there's anybody that's kind of maybe the torch being passed to from Ian it seems that would be you.
Yeah.
How did that all come about?
Just naturally. I mean, we just started. I'd see him here and see him there, and I think we did a couple of. Well, I asked him to record a song called "The Rodeo's Over" on my record called "Hair in My Eyes Like a Highland Steer," and he was good enough to do it. And then I think we ended up singing it together at the Canadian Country Music Awards once or twice. And then I ended up opening some shows for him, and then I went on a little tour with him down to California, opening for his trio, and then we started doing. I opened for him some more, and then he wrote a book maybe 8 years ago called The Long Road, I think it's called. It's his second biography, and it's much more frank and revealing than the first one. I Never Sold My Saddle. I read that one before, but it's a little more kind of guarded, I feel. But that one, The Long Road, is just wide open. It's great. It's really raw. Anyway, I was asked he did a book tour in Canada, and he would go to a theater, and he would be interviewed, maybe play a couple songs, and sometimes it was a press conference, other times it was a theater. But in Calgary, he was doing this in a theater, and they asked me to interview him. So I read both books again a couple times, I made a ton of notes, and then it was just like you and I are now, but on stage, I was interviewing him, asking questions. And by that time, I knew him well enough that I could ask interesting questions that were probably a little bit more inside than a typical journalist. And the whole time I was thinking, shit, this would be great if we had guitars. And so after that, a couple of years later, in 2012 was the 100th anniversary of the Calgary Stampede. And we both felt that there wasn't enough being done about the historical implications of that. Like, there was a lot of celebration stuff, but it was kind of fluffy and that. So we decided to have our own show that was, I can't remember what we called it, 100 Years of Alberta Cowboying or something like that. And it was the two of us just swapping songs as a duo and telling stories and with sort of a loose story arc with the songs about that region up in Alberta, how cowboy culture got up there and the history of it. And then after that, we started doing a lot of duo shows together, and we've done quite a number of them since then. It's pretty fun. He's really interesting. He's like a walking historian of the West. It was neat because through Ian, I became aware of, like, when I grew up in a Western setting, I just thought that was normal and never really thought much of the history of it, other than I got a lot of local history from my grandpas. Like, they tell me all kinds of stuff. But it wasn't until I got to know Ian that I kind of got interested in the whole story and how my family fit into the larger cowboy arc, starting down here in Texas and the herds going north, and that taking with it Western cowboy culture all the way up the Rockies and all the way up to Calgary in Alberta. And all of a sudden, a lot of the stuff that my grandpas used to talk about made sense, and it would fit into this bigger, and it was really fascinating. So I kind of thank him for that and Elko too, because I mean, you go there and you get overwhelmed with the historical stuff, and it's neat to. It made me dig back into the family history a little bit and sort of see how that all fit in, and it was a really, really neat thing. It gives you a sense of place and time, And I feel like I have an interesting situation because my family's pretty homogenous. Like, both sides came from Utah and a little bit northern Nevada. One of my aunts still ranches in Carlin, actually, but yeah. So both sides came from Utah, and I think a lot of them on both sides were Danish, and they both ranched, and they both came up to Alberta, and both sides rodeoed, and both sides ranched up there. So I come from I know some people have a real varied background. They've got a mishmash of things put together. I'm not sure which is better or worse, but in my case, it gives me a real sense of my place in history, I guess. I don't mean that I'm a historical figure, but like in terms of a human being walking the earth, it gives me a sense of where I belong a little bit. Like, I feel really at home all the way down Western America. Like, I feel completely at home here, and it's neat because it's like Chris Lou's band. It's like Western Underground, It's like a subculture that stretches all the way down the Rockies to here, and I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, and we were planning to dig into this, but I feel like when I was younger doing this, I felt a little bit inauthentic because I'm not by any stretch a working cowboy, and I didn't rodeo past 16 years old, and I did a lot of that stuff when I was a kid, and I grew up with it. But now I've come to realize that the role that I'm attempting to play, or the role that I'm enjoying, is the artist that the Western artists, whether they're sculptors or singers or poets or whatever, have a place. Starting as far back as Charlie Russell, right? Like, he was from St. Louis and he kind of did his best, but they say he wasn't the best hand out there. But it's an important role to capture the stuff and be at least be familiar enough with it to capture it properly and present it properly. But I feel a real kinship with the West, and it goes real deep. And I don't. I feel in some ways more at home in Wyoming than I do in Quebec. You know, like, there's more of a north-south connection to me than an east-west in some ways, except for the healthcare part. Well, the interesting thing too is that, I mean, it's really not that old a culture, right? And like, I don't think there are many of us that have like centuries of it, because it really only started, the cowboying as we know it, we refer to it, really didn't start till the mid 1800s, right? I mean, there's Spanish stuff before that, so it's not like there's centuries of British royalty we're talking about. It's like everybody had to start with it somewhere. Some people just decide. I mean, the story of somebody from out east deciding to become a cowboy, like Russell did, is pretty common, right? Like Ian's song about Will James, same deal, right? But yeah, I don't know. It's funny about that too. It's there's real parallels between some of the focus on authenticity in the Western world as there is in gangster rap. Because those guys are seriously, because if you're singing or talking or rapping about the street that you didn't actually get shot, right? Like, those guys are real seriously concerned about, is that guy actually a gangster from that street or not? And to come in and posture like you are one is actually, I think, in some cases physically dangerous. But yeah, I don't know. I think the most important thing as an artist, at least, is to be authentic about who you are. Like, I've never really tried to pretend anything I'm not. And when people do, that's when they get in trouble, I think. It's like, even, if I tell people that when I was a kid and was discovering Bruce Springsteen, I have no reference what it would be like to grow up on the streets in New Jersey, right? But because he owns it, and this is me, and with all the warts and all, this is who I am, and I brushed up against these people, and I grew up with that thing, and this is what happens, and here's my art. It's authentic. It has a universality to it, right? And so I think the important thing as an artist is just to be who you are, whether you're from the suburbs or from the country or from the hood or whatever. I think it's important to just be yourself, whatever that is. And it's interesting about my music, because I think there's a quirkiness to it. Like, I've got one foot very firmly planted in Western stuff, like references and settings of my songs and situations but then there's another thing that approaches the whole thing with a bit of abandon and kind of irreverence. Like, I've never been one to, like, same with bluegrass and stuff. I love all that stuff, but I'm not one of those people who tries to freeze dry it and bow down to it. And, like, I love all that stuff and I respect it all day long, but I think it's important as an artist to take it in and then spit it out again in your own way. And I think I try to do that. And I think that probably the quirky part of my writing might partly be just my personality naturally, but another part of it comes from spending 8 or 9 years in an indie rock band where you're encouraged to be different and not try to do the same thing and take different things and mix them together. And that's kind of baked into the DNA of my songwriting. So the fodder for it is my upbringing and my family history. But then sometimes the way it comes together is maybe a little unusual. That's why I'm not on the radio. But I'm happy there.
In the intro to his classic song, This Cowboy's Hat, Chris Ledoux said this: "There's always been groups of people that never could see eye to eye. And I always thought if they ever had a chance to sit down and talk face to face, they might realize they got a lot in common."
Yeah, we have a really freakishly diverse audience. Like, it's funny because up in Canada, they play us on the radio sometimes on the country stations, and then when we come down to Texas, all the Red Dirt bands and the Texas country guys have sort of been good to us and adopted us, and we kind of fit in the Americana world, and we have enough Western stuff that we do a lot of rodeo shows, and then they seem to like me at Elko, so we have a lot of different feet and irons in the fire as far as where we fit in. But I think, one of the biggest streaks of it is the makeup of the audience, because a lot of, and it'll depend on the region, the proportions change, but a big chunk of our audience are legit agricultural, rural types, farmers, cowboys, ranchers, whatever. But then another big chunk are urban people who are more into songwriting, who might go to a Steve Earle show or something. So, and it's a real reflection of my life, because the more I sing about Western stuff and the better my career gets, the less I have time to do it, right? And the more I'm not in the country and I'm on airplanes and stuff. So it's interesting to me because, we get this mix of people. And they say Willie Nelson did that in the 70s. When he started doing his thing in Austin, he had the bikers there and the cowboys there and the hippies are all mixing together. And I think that's a healthy thing, probably, especially in these days when things are just so polarized, And it's funny because politically it's strange, because I get along with anybody. I can have a conversation. I'm interested in other people's viewpoints, whether I agree with them or not. And my own politics are kind of a grab bag of different things depending on the issue. But it's funny because when I go home to hang out with my guys I grew up with, they think I'm just a communist, right? But when I hang out with my lefty songwriter buddies, they think I'm a total redneck. So it's all relative, right? But it's funny because, as far as I try not to get into politics too much in my music, because I think there's a place for art to transcend that stuff, and there's plenty of time for that stuff. Like we see, especially these days, it's all over the place. So I think there's a place for music and art to speak to a part of the human psyche or the human heart that's not all about politics, and it's not about practical day-to-day issues. There's a deeper frequency to reach people on. I think that's more important in some ways. There's certainly, if you listen to my music, there's some pretty obvious themes, but I try not to hit people over the head with it too much, partly for that reason. And another thing that's interesting about my situation, given my mix of audience, is that I know guys I've got good friends that are sort of left-oriented songwriter guys, and they can preach about left stuff all day to their audience because their whole audience agrees with them. And I also know guys that are country singers at home that they can preach conservative stuff all day to their audience because they're all the same. But mine is such a mix that I just don't touch it because I don't want to waste my time trying to defend what I mean or explain to somebody what I'm trying to say or whatever. So I just mostly tell stories in the songs and let people take out of it what they want. It's really interesting about that because, my Horse Soldier record, It's got a bunch of military history songs, all from different perspectives, and I've had people come up and say that's the best anti-war record I've ever heard, and then I've had vets come in and say, "Yeah, right on, man, you nailed it." So it's interesting because I guess it's like a mirror for people. They take out of it what they want.
One thing that I try to accomplish with this podcast is to show people that cowboy and Western culture is deeper and wider than most would assume. It's also a culture that is shared and celebrated across geographic borders. If Canadian cowboys putting on a rodeo in Zambia doesn't prove that, then I don't know what does.
My grandpa rodeoed in Australia for a season in the 40s, I think, or the 30s, and he also rodeoed at in London. I think it was called Whitehall for the Queen. They had a big show there in the 40s, I think. And my mom and dad went back to Australia in 68, I think, and rodeoed there for a season. And the strangest part about, and it's funny because, and then I played a rodeo music festival in France. And it's interesting, I bring this up because it's interesting how the cowboy thing is perceived globally, because it's one of those things. It's one of the most iconic. You could say just about anybody in any language cowboy, and they probably kind of know what you mean, sort of vaguely. there's not many things you can do that with. Like you could go to Tokyo and probably say cowboy, oh yeah, and they sort of understand. But anyway, it's neat that those guys did that overseas. But the most bizarre case of it was in 73 or 74. It was the 10th anniversary of Zambia's independence from Rhodesia. Like Rhodesia split into Zimbabwe and Zambia in the 60s, I think. And somebody decided for the 10th anniversary party they wanted to have a Wild West show. That somebody got it in their head in the government or something. And so they called the Americans, I think they called was it the PRCA back then? They couldn't get any traction with the Americans, so they called the Canadians. It was called the CRCA back then, and I think they called the Canadian government, and the government was like, "Well, I don't know, call the rodeo people." So Dad was a pretty adventurous guy. He did a lot of interesting stuff, but he heard about it last minute, and he and Mom heard about it on a Thursday, I think, and then by Tuesday they were on a plane to Zambia with another cowboy couple, Tom Buse and his wife Rosemary, who's a childhood friend of my mom's, and then another cowboy. So there's 5 of them went over to Zambia for a month to put on a rodeo for the people there. And I've got this fantastic Super 8 footage of all of it. They had 3 weeks to prepare everything, get the people trained up and get the stock together and build the crowds and the arena. And then they had a 1 week of performances. And the local black African mounted police were ordered to become bronc riders. So I've got this footage, and nothing really bucked too much, of course, but I've got this footage of these guys, these African people trying to wrestle steers and ride broncs. It's really something. And I've got footage of my dad trying to train him to get down on a bulldog and dummy off of a horse just at a walk, And I guess one of the funny stories they tell is that one day Dad's hat blew off in the arena, and he had a broken enough horse he probably wasn't too tall. He reached down and picked up his hat and put it back, and the place went nuts. Like that got the most applause of anything all performance. So they had to do it every time after that. And another thing that happened was the local African people were trying their best to do all this stuff with rodeo stuff, and obviously in a week you can't learn that, and they were impressed with these white Canadian guys that could do all this amazing stuff with animals. And they noticed that every so often these Canadian cowboys would take a pinch of this magic potion they had in a little thing in their back left pocket. So they thought the Copenhagen was some kind of, because they're pretty tribal apparently still at that time. And so they figured that the Copenhagen was some kind of, magical potion or something, or dust, pixie dust. And they got in trouble too, because when they got there, they asked them they got all the people off the plane, and they kept them back and told them to put on all their gear and stuff. And so for the media. And so they came out with the saddles on the shoulders and bandanas and hats and real geared out. And at the end of it, the government representatives said, we're very disappointed in how you came off the plane. And they said, well, we put everything on. What's the problem? He said, well, you weren't wearing your 6-shooters. They figured they'd bring pistols on the plane to Africa with them and wear them. So. But yeah, I'd like to make a documentary about that sometime, because I've got some great footage, and the Buse family, I just talked to them actually at the Stampede in Calgary this year, but they apparently have their own footage, so there might be enough footage to make something. And maybe, I don't know if I'd go back there or try and interview people that were there. I don't know. Yeah, this song's from my last record. It's called S Lazy H. It's kind of a agricultural tragedy about losing the family ranch. It's not really true literally. It's an amalgam. It's a combination of 3 or 4 stories that are true. So it's all the references in it, like the S Lazy H is my buddy's brand. It's actually Scott Holtman. My truck song, The Truck Got Stuck. Mm-hmm. Holtman didn't have nothing better to do but ranch. It's his place. His brand is S Lazy H, and he had a sister that went out east and married a doctor, and he wanted to fly planes and stayed home with his dad. But his sister's all right. She's so far, we got an eye on her though. But yeah, the part about actually losing the place is more other stories that I've heard, and I've sort of overlaid that on his sort of background. So in a sense, it's true because it happens a lot, right? So. Well, I was born in this valley On this ranch I was raised, I learned to lope, rope and dally. On the S, lazy H, where the roots of my people, they run deep on this place. I am 6th generation on the S, lazy H. When it came to the future, I never gave it a thought. If there were broncs to be broken, endless steers to be caught, well, my youth, it was carefree, for the work was my play, and what I loved would always be there on the S, lazy H. I had one beloved sister, a few years younger than me. Before a soul cowboy had kissed her, she left for school in the East. Me, I might have gone to college, might have liked to fly planes, but my dad needed help to run the S, lazy H. So I worked there alongside him, put out all years in this place, and I gained appreciation for the lines on his face. And when Mom had grown older, and when Dad passed away, it fell to me to look after the S, lazy H. By now my sister, she had married a sharp attorney back east. We didn't see eye to eye, but I did my best to make peace. What did they see when they looked over the fence one fine day? They saw a whole lot of value in the S, lazy H. So after thought and assessment, the court awarded them half, and no calf operation carries that kind of cash. Well, I worked through the numbers, worked them every which way. Yeah, I went through the numbers, oh, and boys, I'm afraid I had to sell 30 sections of the S, lazy H. Sometimes right isn't equal, sometimes equal's not fair. There will soon be rows of houses on that ridge over there. Many lifetimes of labor will be all but erased. So shed a tear and look skyward, God help the S, lazy H. The last few years were a struggle, but I gave it my best, and I tried to go forward on the land that was left. Well, I have lived with the sorrow, and I will die with the shame, for now the bank owns what's left of the S, lazy H.
It's a beautiful song.
Thanks.
Thanks for playing that one.
Yeah, it's a wrist cutter, huh?
Hey,
Yeah.
thanks for taking the time to do this. And
Yeah, it's fun. It's good. It's good what you're doing. I'm a fan of the podcast.
all right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Corb Lund for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Corb at corblund.com. I'd like to thank the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about the gathering and buy tickets at nationalcowboypoetrygathering.org. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on the website, or you could take the time to leave a review and a rating on the iTunes store, or you could simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.